All right, China 2060. As always, you have to start with Chinese proverb. Fate is determined by heaven. Actions are born of the individual. So our author, Bryan is giving us a little starter here, and he says he's interested in the tension between these two kinds of fate. So on the one hand, we have things that are beyond our control, versus the things that are in our hand. And this has long been a tension in China and elsewhere, but it is expressed in this statement from several hundred years ago, cited in many historical sources. Fate is determined by heaven, actions are born of the individual. So, China turns out to be very crucial to our future. He says that China is currently responsible for 30% of global carbon emissions, which might be the most in the world. It's not the most per capita. That's us. That's the United States. But it is a huge contributor. To the extent the IEA, International Energy Agency, says that there is no plausible path to limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius without China. That is to say, whatever we do here, you still have to have China on board. Now, traditionally, when China was trying to industrialize, their first idea was you pollute first, clean up later, because you gotta modernize or industrialize or develop. Now, eventually, they did a lot of polluting, and things got pretty bad. There's been a public shift, so people are actually concerned about this. They're talking about it, and actually, there are a lot more renewables. If you look at the growth of solar and wind, it's actually, in fact, on page 167, China has already built the largest solar and wind capacity of any country in the world. So that's more than just talking, biggest of any country in the world. Now, it is true that there's still a lot of coal and fossil fuels because in percentage terms, it's not a lot, but it is growing rapidly. There's been also public pressure or a public shift to environmental consciousness. So people are talking about and thinking about this. And so Tilt says that in 2060, that there's a future conditional. If this happens, then that will happen. So he says, if we do the things right, then this other thing will happen. So if we by 2060, if we do things, what will happen is in China, you'll have wind and solar producing 80% of the electricity. You'll have transportation sector electrified and transformed. They'll have millions of new jobs in renewable energy, and you'll have co-control of pollutants and emissions so that you'll have both public pressure and government control, and so you'll get those emissions and pollutants down by 2060. And as he says, you might think that this is all crazy. If all of this sounds less like imagining and more like fantasizing, consider this. The IEA report, based on the best available data and forecasting methods, concludes that every energy sector in China has a viable path to achieve these goals. In other words, this path is both technologically and economically feasible. So it could be done. It's not guaranteed. You still have that future conditional, but it's feasible. It is possible. He talks about what anthropologists can do, or anthropological contributions to this. So he talks about anthropology being empirical and ethical, linking the empirical and the ethical. By empirical, we mean data, research, and of course, by ethical, we mean what do you do with it or where do you take it? He says that there are three potential contributions. First is simply the broad and holistic understanding of the diversity of human experience. All people, broad and holistic understanding of human diversity, both past and present. So archaeology, evolution, all that stuff that we sometimes study in anthropology, but also present day anthropology. And that positions us to help imagine creative futures. So Bryan Tilt, like Samuel Collins before brings in Margaret Mead's work on the world ahead. An anthropologist anticipates the future. So one of the most famous anthropologists wrote these essays and was thinking about the future a long time ago. The second way in which anthropology contributes is by culturally relevant ethical frameworks. What could those be? So solutions that are based on perhaps more collective action. He also says that in many traditions, philosophical traditions of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, they insist that human affairs are not separate from the natural world. And so there's potentially another cultural connection to draw that the people have these connections to the natural world, which you can draw upon. His third instance is that anthropologists can be advocates for energy justice in the sense that you're trying to advocate for the people who are most down the scale, or to bring to our attention the diversity of people, but especially from the people at the bottom of this. So he concludes again with this idea of on fate and optimism, citing a new book by Scott Moore, China's Next Act. And so Bryan Tilt says that envisioning a human-centered energy transition in China is an exercise in optimism. The idea that our fate is partly in the heavens, but it's also in our hands. And he says it is not a moment for despair, but is most certainly a moment for urgency. So that's where that future conditional comes in. If we do this, then this other good thing might happen. And finally, although a little bit scary, our fate is a shared one. China's efforts to decarbonize its economy will determine, to a large extent, humanity's ability to mitigate the effects of climate change. So we probably want to be doing everything we can to encourage and work together, even if it's competing for the best green technologies, you might say, because we're all wrapped up in this together. Whatever I do with my vehicles and my choices, it also is going to depend on what happens in some of the world's largest economies.